Welcome, Nocturnal Minds, aboard. Your learning journey starts now. So, building on our discussion of the philosophical underpinnings of scientific inquiry, let's now turn to a critical aspect, the ethics governing that very process. What exactly do we mean by the ethics of science? Essentially, it's the entire landscape of moral questions and dilemmas that pop up when scientists are doing their work. Think of it like this. Just as traditional ethics has its branches, metaethics asking about the meaning and grounding of moral claims, normative ethics laying out principles like utilitarianism or deontology, and applied ethics tackling specific issues like bioethics or business ethics, so too does the ethics of science mirror these categories. We have metaethics asking why certain norms apply in science, normative ethics outlining the guiding principles for conduct, and applied ethics dealing with concrete problems like who gets credit for a discovery or how data should be shared. And importantly, this isn't just about individual behavior. It also touches on broader societal and political dimensions, like how research is funded and the rules around intellectual property. Now, let's dive into the meta-ethics of science. This is where we ask the big foundational questions. Why should scientists follow certain ethical rules? What justifies these norms? Well, think of these norms as part of the social epistemology of science, how knowledge is produced collectively. The core idea is that ethical norms aren't arbitrary. They're necessary tools for achieving the fundamental goals of science, finding truth, avoiding mistakes, explaining the world, and even controlling nature. Take honesty and objectivity, for instance. If you want reliable knowledge, you absolutely need these. But it goes deeper. Norms like being open about your methods, giving fair credit, and respecting your colleagues build trust. And trust is paramount. Science is rarely a solo act. It's a massive collaborative enterprise. People share everything: data, techniques, lab space, funding opportunities. They review each other's work, train the next generation. All this requires a high degree of cooperation and trust. Ethical norms are the bedrock of that trust. Furthermore, science doesn't operate in a vacuum. It relies heavily on public support, the money, the resources, the favorable laws and regulations. Unethical behavior, whether it's faking data or plagiarizing, can seriously erode public confidence. If people lose faith in science, they might cut funding, demand more oversight, or even pass laws that stifle research. So, ethics isn't just about internal integrity. It's crucial for the survival and success of science itself. Continuing with the justification of norms, it's also important to remember that science doesn't exist in isolation. Scientific communities are embedded within larger societies, so their ethical norms can't just be whatever they please. They need to align with broader social and moral standards. A prime example is research involving human subjects. The ethical guidelines here, things like informed consent, ensuring fairness, and respecting individuals, are deeply rooted in general moral principles like beneficence, doing good, justice, fairness, and respect for persons. So, dishonesty in science isn't just bad because it messes up the scientific process. It's also wrong because it's a form of lying, which is generally considered morally unacceptable. Similarly, stealing someone else's ideas or data, misappropriating intellectual property, isn't just frowned upon in the scientific community. It's also a form of theft, which is widely seen as immoral. And beyond just morality, unethical conduct often crosses into illegality. There are countless laws and regulations governing research, rules about using human or animal subjects ethically, protecting intellectual property, ensuring lab safety, preventing fraud, prohibiting harassment, and so on. So, when scientists talk about ethics, they're often navigating a complex web of scientific norms, broader moral expectations, and legal requirements. Okay, moving on to another big question in the meta-ethics of science. Are these ethical norms universal? Do the same rules apply to every scientist, everywhere at all times? This immediately brings us back to classic debates in philosophy about moral relativism versus absolutism. And yes, there are definitely controversies suggesting variations. Let's look at authorship and citation practices. In cultures that strongly emphasize individual achievement, like the United States, getting proper credit for your work authorship order, citations is paramount. Failing to acknowledge someone's contribution can be seen as a serious ethical breach, sometimes even bordering on plagiarism. However, in other cultures, perhaps those with more collectivist values, like parts of China or India historically, the emphasis on pinpointing individual contributions in publications might be less intense. This creates real challenges when international collaborations happen. Imagine a researcher from a culture where precise authorship attribution is less critical working with someone from a US university. Navigating these differing expectations can be tricky and sometimes leads to misunderstandings or accusations of ethical lapses on both sides. It raises the question, is there one right way, or are there culturally relative norms here? The debate about universality gets even thornier when we consider research on human subjects, especially in different global contexts. Should the ethical standards be identical worldwide, regardless of local circumstances? Take informed consent. In Western industrialized nations, it's practically gospel. Get informed consent, usually documented via forms. But what happens in a developing country where community leaders often make medical decisions for individuals, or where people have very little understanding of modern medicine or what signing a piece of paper actually means? Or worse, what if a population has no written language at all? Applying the Western model of consent can be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Another hot-button issue is the use of placebo control groups in clinical trials, particularly when effective treatments exist elsewhere. In the West, giving a placebo to someone with a serious illness when a known effective therapy exists is generally considered unethical. You're denying them necessary care. But in the mid-1990s, HIV researchers faced a dilemma. They wanted to test an affordable treatment for mother-to-child transmission in developing nations, but a much more expensive therapy was already available there. Critics argued it was still unethical to use a placebo group. Defenders countered that the expensive therapy wasn't accessible locally due to cost, so the participants weren't worse off than they would have been otherwise. This sparked a huge debate. Should there be a single global standard, or must standards adapt to local realities? Accusations flew. Some called insisting on Western standards for developing nations ethical imperialism. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, highlighting the tension between universal principles and contextual realities. These questions about universality also surface when we look at historical figures and disciplinary differences. Consider Robert Millikan, the physicist famous for measuring the charge of an electron using oil drops. He meticulously recorded 189 observations, but in his final published paper, he excluded 49 of them. Why? Some later critics accused him of unethical data manipulation, essentially cherry-picking results to fit his theory. But others defended him, arguing that we shouldn't judge him by today's standards. Back then, the culture of data handling wasn't as rigorous as it is now. Most contemporary scientists would agree that excluding data points without a very good reason, like identifying them as clear errors or outliers, and failing to disclose this decision is generally frowned upon, if not outright unethical. Now, let's shift gears to disciplinary differences. Even within science, ethical norms can vary. Take authorship again. While almost everyone agrees that authors must have made a significant contribution, what counts as significant differs. In some fields, providing crucial reagents or raw data is enough. In others, it's not. Securing funding, is that a significant contribution? Again, varies, and author order. In some disciplines, the first author is the star, while in others, the last author holds the most prestige. Similar variations exist regarding data sharing. Some fields, like astronomy or genomics, have strong norms for sharing data openly. Others, particularly those where patents are central to commercialization, tend to be more protective of unpublished data. These differences highlight that while there might be core ethical principles, their interpretation and application can certainly vary across time, culture, and discipline. So, where does this leave us on the question of universality? The text argues for a balanced view. It acknowledges that reasonable variations in ethical norms exist due to cultural, disciplinary, and historical factors. We shouldn't expect identical rules everywhere, all the time. However, it also rejects complete moral relativism. There must be some core ethical norms that transcend these differences and are essential to what we recognize as scientific practice. Think about it. Could you call a field science if it had no prohibition against faking data or deliberately distorting results? Probably not. Adherence to honesty and objectivity seems fundamental to the very idea of scientific inquiry, even if how these are interpreted or applied might differ. Perhaps openness and freedom of inquiry are also core. The argument is that these define the boundaries of science. Norms that don't play this definitional role, like respect for animal welfare or human subjects, might be considered peripheral. For example, 17th and 18th century anatomists performed vivisections without anesthesia, showing little concern for animal suffering by modern standards. Yet, we'd still refer to their work as anatomy or science, even though it violated modern norms on animal treatment. Calling a norm peripheral doesn't mean it's unimportant or morally insignificant. Respect for human subjects, for instance, is arguably one of the most vital ethical principles in science. Even if some researchers throughout history have unfortunately flouted it while conducting technically sound experiments. Alright, let's move from the meta-level to the normative ethics of science. This is where we get down to brass tacks. What specific norms, standards, or principles should guide how scientists behave? There are different philosophical approaches to figuring this out. One is the top-down approach, which takes broad ethical theories like utilitarianism maximizing overall well-being, Kantian ethics focusing on duties and rights, natural rights, or virtue ethics cultivating good character and applies them to scientific situations. Another is the bottom-up or casuist approach, which suggests that scientists should handle each ethical dilemma as it comes, looking at past cases and precedents for guidance. Then there's the mid-level or principle-based approach, which focuses on applying specific ethical values directly relevant to science, like honesty, objectivity, social responsibility, etc. The author here leans towards the principle-based approach, arguing it's the most practical. Why? Because applying abstract ethical theories can be incredibly difficult for busy scientists. And while looking at past cases is useful, the casuist approach lacks a consistent framework for justifying decisions to others or explaining choices systematically. Principles, on the other hand, offer a clearer, more coherent set of guidelines that scientists can actually use to navigate ethical complexities. So, what are these key principles? Let's start with the basics. First, honesty seems obvious, right? Scientists should be honest in their research, in publications, and in dealings with peers, funders, regulators, and the public. This isn't just about being nice. It's fundamental to achieving scientific goals and aligns with broader societal morals. Laws against fraud, for instance, are built on this commitment. Second, objectivity. The aim is to strive for objectivity, to let evidence and reasoning guide conclusions, not personal bias or prejudice. This supports the core epistemic goals of science, finding truth and avoiding error. Practical strategies like keeping meticulous records, relying on peer review, replicating studies, and managing conflicts of interest are all designed to foster objectivity. Even when testifying as an expert witness, scientists have an obligation to be objective. Third, openness. Science thrives on sharing. Scientists should share data, results, ideas, methods, tools, and resources. As Newton famously put it, we stand on the shoulders of giants. That sharing allows progress. Openness is crucial for publication, peer review, replication, and building collective knowledge. Of course, there are legitimate reasons for secrecy, like protecting intellectual property claims or maintaining confidentiality during peer review or in sensitive research areas. But the default expectation is openness. Next up, freedom. Scientists should be free to pursue research without fear of political or religious persecution, coercion, or censorship. This applies to the institutions supporting science and the governments overseeing it. Freedom is essential for innovation, discovery, and the critical questioning that drives science forward. Think of Galileo facing the Inquisition, or Soviet biologists punished for disagreeing with Lysenkoism. History is full of examples of scientists defending their intellectual freedom. However, this freedom isn't absolute. It doesn't guarantee funding. Research sponsors, whether corporations or governments, can choose where to invest money based on their priorities. And it certainly doesn't mean scientists can ignore laws or regulations designed to protect people, property, or national security. The sixth principle is fair credit allocation. Give people credit for their contributions. This seems basic, but it's incredibly important for collaboration and trust. People who work together deserve recognition. Proper citation when using others' work reflects this. Rules against plagiarism and authorship guidelines stem from this principle. For scientists, publication priority and citation are literally the currency of the profession. It's estimated that a large chunk of ethical disputes in science boils down to disagreements about who gets credit for what. Moving on to interpersonal and institutional norms. Seventh, respect for colleagues. Treat your peers, students, postdocs, and supervisors with respect. This builds the cooperative and trusting environment needed for science. It's a basic moral duty to respect other people. This means actively avoiding harassment, discrimination, abuse, or exploitation. Eighth, respect for property. This covers both physical and intellectual property belonging to individuals, labs, universities, or companies. Respecting property is crucial for trust and collaboration. If people fear their equipment, data, or inventions might be damaged or stolen, they'll be less willing to share or collaborate. Think about lab equipment, reagents, computer code, collected samples, patented devices, or copyrighted papers, all fall under this. Ninth, respect for laws. Scientists must comply with the laws, regulations, policies, and guidelines relevant to their work. This includes government rules, institutional policies, and professional codes. Compliance helps secure public support and builds trust. There's also a general moral obligation to obey laws, as they serve societal functions like protecting people and maintaining order. Laws cover a vast range of research areas from human subjects to lab safety, conflict of interest, harassment, controlled substances, IP, and record keeping. Now, there's a nuance here. While scientists must generally obey laws, they do have the right to conscientiously object to laws they believe are deeply immoral or unjust, sometimes risking personal consequences for the sake of higher principles. Think of Vesalius dissecting bodies despite illegal restrictions, or Galileo challenging church doctrine. Finally, two more principles focusing on resources and broader impact. Hence, stewardship of research resources. Scientists should take good care of the resources they use: equipment, buildings, money, samples, geographical sites, even human communities involved in research. This isn't just about being frugal, it's about responsible management. Good stewardship helps advance science effectively and maintains public trust. Think about archaeologists carefully excavating a site to preserve it for future researchers rather than stripping it bare. Wasting public funds or mismanaging resources damages the public's willingness to support science. 11th, social responsibility. Scientists should engage in activities that benefit society. This can take many forms: testifying before Congress, educating the public about science, warning about potential dangers of new technologies, or simply conducting research that addresses societal needs. Why does this matter? Firstly, like anyone else, scientists have a moral duty to contribute positively and avoid harm. Secondly, since science receives substantial public investment through education and funding, there's an obligation to give back. And thirdly, demonstrating social responsibility helps maintain public confidence and support for the scientific endeavor. These 10 principles provide a framework for ethical conduct in science. Now, the last 2 principles are special cases, focusing on specific vulnerable populations used in research. 12. Human treatment of animal subjects. Where animals are used in research, scientists have a duty to protect and promote their welfare. Acknowledging the moral objections to animal research, the text notes its undeniable contributions to biomedical knowledge. The guiding principles here are often summarized by the SAN reduction: minimize the number of animals used whenever possible. Replacement: substitute animal subjects with alternatives like cell cultures or computer models if feasible. Refinement: improve experimental techniques to minimize pain and distress. Why does this matter? Firstly, inhumane treatment can actually skew research results. Animals in extreme pain react differently. Secondly, it's a moral obligation to minimize unnecessary suffering. Thirdly, treating animals humanely fosters public support for science. 13th, respect for human subjects. This is arguably the most critical ethical area. Researchers must respect the rights of human participants and protect them from harm and exploitation, regardless of the type of research, psychological, sociological, biomedical, etc. The reasons are clear. Moral duties apply to humans, and public trust depends on respecting human dignity. Key principles include informed consent, beneficence, ensuring the research promotes welfare and minimizes harm, privacy protecting confidentiality, justice ensuring fair distribution of risks and benefits, and equitable selection of subjects. And the scientific validity, don't enroll people in studies that are poorly designed and unlikely to yield useful results. These last two principles underscore the heightened ethical responsibilities when dealing with sentient beings. Before wrapping up the normative ethics section, a few important comments on these principles. First, they should be understood as prima facie obligations. This means they're general guidelines, rules of thumb, not rigid, exceptionless commands. Sometimes these norms can conflict with each other, or with laws, regulations, or company policies. For instance, the norm of openness might clash with social responsibility. If publishing certain information could cause significant harm, imagine publishing details on creating a bioweapon. Or consider a scientist bound by a contract to keep company data confidential, but discovers the company is hiding dangerous side effects of a drug. Which norm takes precedence? Deciding requires careful judgment and balancing different considerations. Second, these norms are prescriptive, not descriptive. They tell scientists how they ought to act, based on philosophical reasoning about the nature of good scientific practice. They aren't sociological surveys stating what scientists actually do. Of course, most scientists probably do adhere to most of these norms most of the time, otherwise, science wouldn't function. But the ethics discussed here aims to explain why science works well, not just describe its messy reality. Third, as with many ethical standards, some of these scientific norms overlap with existing laws and regulations. When science norms align with legal requirements, there's no conflict. But when they clash, that's when real ethical dilemmas arise for the scientist. Okay, shifting gears completely now. We've been talking about the ethics guiding scientific practice. Let's delve into the practice itself, specifically experimentation. For a long time, philosophers of science were much more interested in grand theories, how they're confirmed or falsified. Experimentation, while obviously crucial, got relatively less attention until the 1980s. Schrödinger pointed out something interesting. Unlike astronomers passively observing stars, physicists have the liberty to actively interfere with their objects and set up controlled conditions. This power allows for methods often vastly superior to passive observation. The rise of systematic experimentation in the 17th century, championed by folks like Bacon, was fueled by new instruments, telescopes and microscopes extending our senses. Air pumps creating artificial conditions, barometers measuring quantitative changes. But this new approach faced skepticism. Critics worried, are these artificially created phenomena real? And how do we know the instruments aren't just distorting reality? How can we trust these results? Early experimentalists tackled this by emphasizing that their results could be replicated by anyone, anytime, and by performing experiments publicly, publishing detailed reports, so others could verify the findings themselves. By the 18th century, the validation of experimental knowledge became less of a philosophical battleground. Fast forward to the 19th and early 20th centuries. Philosophers who did write about experiment focused on different aspects. John Stuart Mill was keen on how experiments could help establish causal relationships, figuring out not just that two things happen together, but that one causes the other. He saw direct observation as inherently imperfect for this without experimental intervention. He developed various methods for inferring causation from experimental data. Then there's Pierre Duhem, whose reflections on experiment had a huge impact. He focused on the relationship between experimental results and scientific theories, proposing three key theses. First, the famous theory-ladenness of results. Doom argued that when you run an experiment, you don't just perceive raw facts. You interpret those perceptions using existing theoretical frameworks. The results you report are already abstract representations mediated by theory. Second, this leads to a gap between the concrete facts observed and the theoretical results derived. Because interpretation involves theory, and because measurements are never perfectly precise, the same set of observations could potentially support infinitely many logically incompatible theoretical statements. Third, and a perhaps most influential, Dufam emphasized the holistic nature of theory testing. An experiment doesn't test a single hypothesis in isolation. Predictions require a whole group of hypotheses, the main theory plus assumptions about the apparatus, background conditions, etc. If the prediction fails, the experiment tells us that at least one hypothesis in that group is wrong, but it doesn't specify which one. Conversely, if the prediction succeeds, it confirms the entire set of hypotheses used to make the prediction. This third thesis really shook up the simplistic view of experiment as a straightforward test of theory. For much of the 20th century, despite the undeniable importance of experimentation in science, philosophers largely ignored the process of experimentation itself. The logical empiricists, for instance, were fascinated by the logical structure of knowledge, but they mostly focused on the final outputs, the observations and results, as the crucial link between theory and reality. Karl Popper, while emphasizing falsification, portrayed experiment as entirely driven by theoretical questions. Experiments are designed to test specific conjectures proposed by theorists. Experiment had no independent role. Then came the historicist turn in philosophy of science, roughly the 1960s and 70s, influenced by thinkers like Kuhn and Feyerabend. They pushed the theory-ladenness idea even further, arguing that even basic observations are theory-laden. Drawing on psychology, they claimed that observers with different theoretical beliefs literally see different things when looking at the same phenomenon. This seemed to completely undermine the idea that experiment could serve as a neutral arbiter between competing theories. If observation itself is theory-laden, how can experimental results provide unbiased evidence? This orientation, heavily focused on theory, began to look increasingly incomplete, neglecting the rich world of experimental practice. This neglect started to change decisively, influenced by Ian Hacking's work, particularly representing and intervening. Hacking brought the actual activity of experimentation back into philosophical focus. The emphasis shifted from the final results to the process, designing the experiment, building the apparatus, running the setup, troubleshooting. This new wave of experimental philosophy raised several key issues. First, the significance of observation itself came under scrutiny. Hacking famously argued that observation as traditionally understood isn't that central. What's really crucial is knowing when the experiment is working correctly, detecting anomalies, noise, drift, ensuring the setup is behaving as expected. This requires a different kind of perceptual skill, picking up subtle cues from the equipment rather than just reading dials. Second, the function of experimentation was broadened. It's not just about testing existing theories. Experiments are also used to measure fundamental constants, to aid in the construction of new theories, and crucially, to explore new phenomena systematically, often before any guiding theory exists. Think of early explorations in electricity or radio waves. Third, the problematic thesis of theory-ladenness was re-examined. Could the idea that observation is theory-laden actually undermine the objectivity of theory choice? Perhaps not, if we distinguish carefully between the background knowledge needed to operate an instrument and the specific theory being tested. A central question in this new experimental philosophy is, how does an experiment end? When does the experimenter decide that the results obtained are valid and reliable? Every experiment is plagued by potential sources of noise, random fluctuations, environmental disturbances, instrumental drift. The experimenter needs to identify and eliminate or account for these sources before trusting the results. Consider Henry Cavendish's famous experiment to measure the gravitational force between two lead balls. The force was incredibly tiny. To detect it accurately, he had to ensure the temperature in the room was perfectly constant, because even slight temperature differences causing air currents could rotate the delicate arm. So he sealed the apparatus in a room, controlled it remotely, and watched it through a telescope. He also calculated the gravitational pull of the wooden case holding the apparatus to ensure it wasn't distorting the measurements. The decision to stop the experiment and report a result likely came when the readings stabilized, suggesting the main noise sources had been tamed. In general, experimenters use various methods to ensure validity, especially when different experiments yield conflicting results. Pinpointing the faulty results requires judgment, not just following a recipe. Because these decisions involve judgment, they leave room for disagreement. This has led to different interpretations. Realist philosophers argue that, while judgment plays a role, disagreements about experimental results are typically resolved rationally through good arguments and compelling evidence. Experimental conclusions gain a certain stubbornness; they resist easy overturning just because a competing theory changes. On the other hand, radical social constructivists seized on this non-algorithmic aspect. They argued that scientific facts are social constructions. Choices about what counts as valid data or a reliable result aren't determined purely by rational argument or the material world. Instead, they are shaped by social dynamics within the scientific community, professional interests, power struggles, consensus building. They contend that the constraints of nature on scientific outcomes are minimal. Interestingly, even social constructivists usually concede that arguments and reasons do play a role, but they deny these are rationally decisive. Other factors ultimately tip the scales. A more nuanced response, drawing back to Duhem, acknowledges that judgment is key. Duhem himself noted that pure logic isn't the only rule for our judgments. Good sense plays a vital role. He observed that scientific controversies eventually close when good sense clearly favors one side, even if pure logic allows continued debate. Perhaps this evolving good sense, forged through experience and negotiation within the scientific community, is what gives experimental conclusions their robustness and resistance to theoretical shifts. Let's revisit the relationship between experiment and theory, challenging the old view that experiment is merely a tool for testing pre-existing theories. Hopper said a theorist asks the question, the experimenter provides the answer. But many experiments, especially early exploratory ones, happen without a clear theoretical question in mind. Think of early electrical experiments before Maxwell's equations. The act of exploring and stabilizing these phenomena was part of figuring them out conceptually. Theory plays a role, but it's diverse. From vague hypotheses to precise mathematical models, theory influences how experimenters isolate phenomena and judge acceptable data. Now, back to theory-latedness. Does the fact that designing an experiment requires background knowledge necessarily mean it's circular when testing a theory? Not necessarily. As Hacking pointed out, the theory used to model an instrument or understand its operation is usually different from the theory being tested. If the background knowledge is distinct, the experimental results can act as a neutral ground for comparing different theories. Consider Peter Siemens' discovery of the Zeeman effect, spectral lines splitting in a magnetic field. His experiments relied on wave optics and sophisticated instruments Rowland grating. Later, this effect was explained by both classical electromagnetism and quantum theory. The experimental results provided neutral data that both theories had to account for. Even if, hypothetically, the background knowledge did overlap with the theory being tested, disconfirmation could still occur. Shapiro noted that, even if you use a mercury thermometer based on thermal expansion theory to test if metals expand when heated, the experiment could still fail to confirm the hypothesis. The refutation might even be clearer in such cases, as there's no auxiliary hypothesis to blame. So, to wrap up this exploration of experimental practice, the key takeaway is the autonomy of experimentation. Experimental practice has its own history, its own logic, largely independent of the dominant high-level theories of the time. Recognizing this autonomy reshapes how we think about the history of science. Theoretical revolutions didn't always coincide with shifts in experimental practice, and vice versa. It also prompts a promising shift in philosophy of science, moving beyond just analyzing the end product's knowledge claims to systematically studying the activity itself. This leads to a richer view of science, not just as a body of knowledge, but as an evolving array of interconnected practices, formulating theories, designing and building instruments, analyzing data statistically, managing complex collaborations, and yes, conducting experiments. This broader perspective opens up exciting new avenues for dialogue between historians and philosophers of science. For instance, Hacking and Pickering revisited Duhame's thesis, suggesting scientists might have even more flexibility than Duham realized, sometimes choosing to modify the experimental apparatus itself to achieve agreement with theory, treating experimental results as plastic resources. This wouldn't have been conceivable without focusing intently on the practice of experimentation. Thank you.